webinar is sponsored by the Mass Peace Action Education Fund, the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and the Institute for Policy Studies New Internationalism Project. The National Security Strategy is a document, I believe it is required by Congress that every administration writes. It doesn't start any wars and it doesn't buy any battleships, but it kind of is a political frame or a policy frame of what the administration thinks it's trying to do in foreign policy. And the national security strategy of the second Trump administration is quite different than the one of his first administration, and quite different from all the ones since 1945, or as far back as, at least this is what most of the commentators say. I certainly have not read all of them. I've read a couple. It's actually written in an accessible manner, it's not written in a wonky manner. It's written in a I won't say a grassroots manner, but in a political manner that's trying to advocate for a perspective and build support for it. I think it's a very different perspective than the one our organizations would support, but it's useful to understand it and to analyze what it means that the administration has come out with this. Our presenters tonight are Joseph Gerson. He is president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. He's vice president of the International Peace Bureau, and he's a board member of Mass Peace Action. And in the past, he was the head of the Peace and Economic Security Program of the American Friends Service Committee. He's author of Empire and the Bomb, How the U.S. Uses Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World, and With Hiroshima Eyes, Atomic War, Nuclear Extortion, and Moral Imagination. Better put a picture of him up. And then our second presenter is Khury Petersen-Smith. He's the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow and the co-director of the new Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. He researches U.S. empire, borders, and migration, and strategizes with activists to work against the violence that the U.S. carries out and supports around the world. Khury focuses especially on U.S. militarism in the Middle East and in the Pacific, and movements that resist it. He graduated from Clark University Graduate School of Geography after completing a dissertation on U.S. military bases in the Pacific. And he is one of the co-authors and organizers of the 2023 Black Voices for Ceasefire statement, which was signed by over 6,000 Black activists, artists, and scholars. Each of our presenters will lay out some introductory remarks, and then we'll have time for questions. First up is Joseph. Take it away, Joseph Gerson.
Thank you, Cole, and it's a pleasure to be working with Khury, and I'm really looking forward to his take on it all. Maybe the way to begin would be to say that things that look like they can't stand, can't endure, don't. And so what we, I think, are seeing, and this is, I think, going to take a lot of adjustment, certainly for people of my generation, to see the end of the Cold War and even the post-Cold War orders. The document itself is painful to read. It begins with just the worst kind of obsequiousness and praise of our great leader. And it's got a lot of bragging about how we obliterated Iran's nuclear program. But it kind of moves beyond what we had in the first Trump administration and very much crystallizes what we've seen in this past year. It essentially declares an end to Pax Americana, that global hegemony, as it says, is fundamentally undesirable and an impossible goal. I mean, that's sort of quite remarkable for something coming out of the White House. Richard Haass, who headed the Council on Foreign Relations, says it's, quote, the biggest redirection of U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II and the dawn of the Cold War. And the Chinese are saying that it basically is moving from the unipolarity to multipolarity, that it's, if you will, a recognition of the multipolarity of the world. The Russians are telling us, Russian leadership is saying that it's pretty consistent with their vision, and leaders in Europe are panicked. I think we need to understand that it's not simply Trump who is doing this. I think we need to understand that it's the result of how a number of elite alliances are making sense of fundamental changes that have occurred certainly over the post-Cold War period. For the Chinese, they see it as a consequence of hegemonic failures, of U.S. economic fragility, of economic and social and political fragmentation here in the United States, and the end of international perceptions that the United States is invincible. So it's a recognition, that the empire has cracked, and then how to reconsolidate U.S. power. It can be read, I think, as a response to China's rise and its global influence. In many respects, China's economy now is larger than that of the U.S. It's developed a number of area denial weapons that can challenge U.S. Indo-Pacific hegemony. And we saw, those of you who read the New York Times, Sunday's special section on China's military beginning to outpace that of the United States, and calling for massive increases in U.S. military spending. This is the New York Times, and calling for greater investment in a whole range of new weapons as part of a new revolution in military affairs. Walden Bello in the Philippines, who I have the greatest respect for, sees it as a compromise between three forces in Trump's coalition. On the one hand, maximists who still cling to the dream of American dominance. Then what he calls the specifists, led by Eldridge Colby, who's like number 3 at the Pentagon. He and his allies believe America must retreat from Europe and the Middle East to focus single-mindedly on China. And then what he calls the continentalists or neo-Monroeists, led by Stephen Miller and Vice President Vance. I hate to say that word, Vice President Vance, but they advocate, as Bello said, an almost hermit-like re-entrenchment, turning the U.S. into a fortress continent. So these are some of the ways that it's seen, and it grows out of, among other things, the United States reduced percentage of global GDP. The impacts of offshoring on standards of living here in the United States, and the information revolution that's led to the immense concentration of wealth, which has resulted in the greatest inequality that has been seen for a very long time, and impacts people all across the country. We did that, yeah. So. Among the forces as well is the both within the United States and internationally a kind of disillusionment with the United States and the West due to the failed Iraq and Afghanistan wars and the U.S.-Israeli war against Palestinians and Arabs. Yeah, we'll leave that for the second. And we also are dealing with the new world here of the Russian-Chinese alliance. I was on a Track 2 session this morning where the talk was about the challenges not only of Russia, but by China to the Arctic, the high north, the Arctic Ocean, and its as the ice melts, its trade routes. We also have the emergence of the global South as a force. There's a book I would recommend to everyone here called The World After Gaza by Mishra. And what it basically tells us is that in the wake of the not only the long history, going back to Vietnam, the conquest of the Philippines, but also to the failed wars of the post-Cold War period, that the contradictions the so-called rules-based order stands as a fraud in ways that hadn't been seen before. And the Gaza war itself serves to much of the world as a revealing of 500 years of white supremacist militarism, and that's no longer being swallowed. We can say more there, but I'll jump over it. Some of the responses, Germany is now in the position of becoming the leading continental military force, minus nuclear weapons in Europe. And Chancellor Merz has described this as the end of Pax Americana. A European Council of Foreign Relations researcher says the West as it used to be no longer exists. I mean, that's pretty profound, and I think that's true. Carl Bildt, the former Swedish prime minister, says the strategy places the U.S., this is a quote, to the right of the extreme right in Europe. And as we see today, with more barriers going up against global South nations in terms of migration, we can see the what we call it, the circling the wagons to keep people of color out of the country. It's also sown panic among U.S. neoconservatives and liberal imperialists. Anne Applebaum, who you can read in lots of liberal media, wrote, quote, "It's hard to think of another great power ever abdicating its influence so quickly and so publicly." So this is going to, reverberate through our culture quite a bit. And one of the things that we're seeing here, and there were actually articles in Foreign Affairs back, maybe as far back as last spring, talking about elites in Washington wanting to move toward spheres of influence rather than global control, the emergence of blocs and a new order being defined by blocs, principally those of the United States and China. Some of its elements include the denigration of commitments to international organizations like the United Nations and the focus on the Monroe Doctrine. And we can see this with these, the presence of the aircraft carrying the fleet off the coast of Venezuela, but the seizure of the oil tanker, which is designed as, kind of Rubio's effort to further isolate and overthrow the government in Cuba. We have in the text, in the statement, kind of a predictable commitment to, quote, building the world's most powerful, lethal, and technologically advanced military. Of course, they say they want non-intervention, but here goes that military. It's designed, and throughout the whole statement, you see the focus on the economy. So all of this is rationalized. All the foreign policy is designed to make the United States, and of course the elite that is running it, more wealthy. We also see some of the ramifications of all this in this morning's Washington Post, where it reports that the U.S. There's a major change in the Pentagon, that the U.S. Central Command, its European Command, and its African Command are all to be downgraded and integrated into a new international campaign, with the reduction of forces to be basically transferred to the Western Hemisphere, and they don't say it, but let's assume it's also going to be to the Indo-Pacific. I want to focus just on some of the contradictions, ignorance, and white supremacy. It pervades the paper. The use of code words are prevalent, so we can read the words. The strategy is committed to restoration and reinvigoration of American spiritual and cultural health, strong traditional families that raise healthy families. We heard this anywhere before? It says that mass migration has strained American domestic resources, increased violence and other crime, weakened social cohesion, and undermined national security. So, friends, it's the people of color who've been coming into this country who are making things impossible here, so they say. It pledges to root out, this is its words, root out DEI. part of me is thinking in margins of time, it may be worthwhile for all of us to read how post-Civil War Reconstruction was taken down, and to see the strategy as part of such a campaign. As I said before, it's ostensibly commits to non-intervention, but we see this is not really true. Heather Cox Richardson, the liberal but critical historian, says that the national security strategy is explicit in its goal of creating a white supremacist country, rejecting immigration, and restoring Europe's civilizational self-confidence in Western identity. In some ways, it's quite consistent with the Great Replacement theory that was recently revived in Charlottesville, but grows out of Nazi history. And it has its claim that, of course, President Trump, we all know, has ended 8 wars. I mean, he's the great hero of peace. But tell that to the people in Gaza, tell that to people in Sudan, and tell that to people in Cambodia and in Thailand, where they're saying that that was never a commitment to a ceasefire. Among some of its priorities, and Cole, I'm going to ask you to give me a heads up when I've got 5 minutes left. Throughout, as I said, it prioritizes commerce and access to other nations' raw materials and markets. The New York Times tells us, quote, the world is, it basically describes the world as seen from the White House as a place where America can use its vast powers to make more money. That's from the New York Times. It seeks, quote unquote, balanced trade and access to resources and supply chains, and focuses on reindustrialization. We saw today how great that was with the increase in unemployment going on. It has pushback against what it calls non-hemispheric competitors' economic presence in the Western Hemisphere, and it says basically we've got to drive that out. And as part of reinforcing U.S. power globally, it calls for the dollars to maintain the dollar's global reserve status. It's a commitment to ostensibly a free and open Pacific as long as we control it. And you have a situation where all U.S. diplomats, every one of them, has a responsibility now to be advocating and working for greater market access for the United States all over the world. That's part of their that's part of their job. In Latin America, there's a demand that Latin America says, quote, Latin America must grant no bid contracts to U.S. companies. So it's just forcing it open. There's been a lot related. I'll try to focus on 2 areas: Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Europe is valued in the statement as a trade partner, but as I said before, Europe has basically been thrown under the bus. Its dependence on the United States over the last 80 years is, in some ways, U.S. distances from it, and you have in Europe quite a bit of panic among leaders in terms of facing Russia without the U.S. behind it. It positions the United States, pulls back from NATO in some very serious ways, and basically positions the United States to be a mediator between Europe and Russia. And we see this, with the diplomacy related to the Ukraine war. And what have I got here? Sorry. There's a commitment in there to no NATO expansion. It took long enough to actually say that, it doesn't say NATO shouldn't exist, but when you hear in Europe what they're talking about with U.S. pulling back is the possible emergence of a NATO light, with the United States barely in it and the Europeans having to pull themselves in greater unity. In the Times, Steve Erlanger writes that Europeans see Trump's main goal not as peace in Ukraine, but rapprochement with Russia that is trying to undermine NATO. So the splitting of the alliance. A German Reichstag member of their parliament, conservative, said the U.S. has sided with the aggressor against the interests of the attacked country, Ukraine, and against European security interests in general. And this is how it's seen across the European establishment. And we're going to see out of this even further drive for European increased militarization, the expansion of their conventional forces, and debate over what one European referred to as the Eurobomb. Questions as to whether France or Britain will provide the nuclear umbrella, but also the questions here of Germany and how it will relate to the possibility of French or British domination in Europe. The Germans are, again, a big change. We never thought that Germany would emerge as a great power, but that's sort of the ambition. Some, including Danish intelligence services, see the U.S. as a security risk. It's gotten that wild. This is from Danish intelligence. Quote, the United States uses economic power, including in the form of threats of high tariffs, to enforce its will, and it no longer excludes the use of military force, even against its allies. So here the Danes are looking at Greenland, and again, not much on the peace movement's agenda has been the growing contest for control over the Northwest Passage, which will have great economic and military consequences in the high north. Moving along. Yeah, and then of course, there's been a lot of commentary just in terms of its racism in relationship to Europe. The quote from the strategy: "We want Europe to remain European," and this applies to both migration and to taking down the regulations to open the way for greater U.S. penetration of European markets. It says that Europe faces civilization erasure, necessitating U.S. support for resistance to its liberal democratic governments. And this it calls for, quote, U.S. support for, quote unquote, patriotic political forces in Europe, which is to say fascist forces like the AfD in Germany, Le Pen in France, and Farage in Britain. And, there are antecedents for this. Think of Vance's speech, last March in Munich. Trying to skip over things I've already said. Got that. All right, so let's turn to Indo-Pacific. I'll try to move through it quickly. Ostensibly, China is no longer a peer competitor, but the goal, quote, is to seek mutually advantageous economic relationship with Beijing, while at the same time asserting the U.S. need to maintain dominance over the first island chain, which is to say the area running from Korea down through Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and around to Australia. And the U.S. military is committed to holding U.S. dominance there. It's interesting, some of the commentary about the relationship to China. It reminds us that Trump will be going to China in March, and that they sort of softened the language and the rhetoric in the statement, in part to help ensure that Trump gets the narcissistic greeting that he's hoping for. It's really clear, and we've known this for some time, that the Indo-Pacific, quote, is among the next century's key economic and geopolitical backgrounds. And it says to thrive at home, we must successfully compete there. But it says, interestingly, that the Indo-Pacific alliances, especially the Quad and with AUKUS, remain, quote unquote, the bedrock of security and prosperity for the region and for the United States. It does look to increased economic cooperation with China if it can be negotiated, with a focus especially on maintaining supply chains. And as we learned, last month, the centrality of rare earths and rare earth metals, because when we had that kind of spitting trade war rhetoric between Trump and Xi, and 140% tariffs that Trump was threatening, the Chinese came back with the equivalent of an economic atomic bomb, basically threatening to cut off the export of rare earth minerals and the magnets, which are essential to most of the, if you will, postmodern economic growth and development, and also militaries.
All right, Joseph, you got 4 minutes.
Okay, so we'll go to Taiwan and then quickly through the rest. So Taiwan remains obviously central, and it's interesting. Why is Taiwan important to the United States? On the one hand, because it's a geopolitical quirk that is essential to maintaining basically the unity, a single theater across the Indo-Pacific, and to prevent China from breaking through. But also, of course, for its semiconductors, which are the most advanced in the world and are essential to the AI and other high-tech arms races. Go quickly, Latin America. We don't have to say much more about it. We've got the new Monroe Doctrine, the increased military deployments there. Nuclear weapons. We have a commitment to a new nuclear space and naval arms race. Your tax dollars are going to be increased for that. Again, there's the central pledge to advance the so-called Golden Dome, the missile defense system that will never work. I was at a meeting of the Arms Control Association in Washington, where its head said, I speak to a lot of physicists, and none of them say it will work. None of them believe it can work. And he says, China and other countries also have physicists too. But what missile defenses will do is it will be a huge giveaway to the military-industrial complex, be a waste of billions upon billions of dollars, which could literally bankrupt the United States. Khury will certainly focus on its implications for the Middle East, but simply to say that the commitments there are to revitalize U.S. alliances with Gulf and Arab partners, to prevent an adversarial power from dominating the Middle East and its oil and gas supplies, and maybe even most centrally, looking at the Gulf and other Arab states as a source of both a destination and a source of investment for economic development. Yeah. And then I guess just finally to say, it's interesting the way that the thing is written. So it starts with the Western Hemisphere, then it moves to Indo-Pacific, then it moves to the middle to Europe, and at the end you have a few paragraphs related to Africa and the Middle East. And for Africa, it's just clear. Africa is important to us because we want mutually beneficial trade relations, and we want to harness access to African natural resources. This is what colonialism in Africa has been all about. And one way to read the doctrine, as well as say the Gaza peace plan, is a new generation and manifestation of American colonialism. So I've run through all this. I think this is going to have to impact the strategies for our movement. I think we're going to have to digest this and understand its particular impacts. And on we go. And Khury, I'm looking forward to hearing how your angle of vision on all of this.
Thanks, Joseph, for that comprehensive look, and especially valuable was that survey of responses from different quarters that you treated us to at the beginning. That's very helpful context. Let's go to Khury for his remarks.
Oops. Thanks, Cole. And thanks to everybody at Mass Peace Action for organizing this. Of course, thanks to Joseph for this really excellent summary. And thank you to all of you for joining us. It's, I guess, the good news, to the extent that it exists, is that we really have, over these past couple of years, since the beginning of this catastrophic genocide in Gaza, we have witnessed and have participated in really the largest mobilizations against militarism in this country since at least the US invasion of Iraq. And it's not just the kind of breadth of the mobilizations, but the extent to which they have been sustained, the extent to which they have involved people from sectors throughout the society, students and community people, and people in workplaces deciding that they don't want to participate in this genocide, and so on and so on and so on. And it is important as we figure out what we're doing next to confront and resist the latest chapters of that genocide in Palestine, that we also work to expand our scope. You know, for so many people who have been activated, some people in this country who have been activated around that genocide, for whom US militarism has become visible, along with what we see on our streets from the National Guard and militarized police forces, what we're witnessing in the Caribbean. All of this is making what has been put in the shadows, that is, US wars and militarism, has been largely hidden from the US population. This is a time of great revelation. And so it's critical that we expand the mobilization and expand the organizing. And that's why this conversation to grapple with this document and what it represents is so important. So real gratitude to all of you for joining. I'm going to try to keep it brief so we get into what's on your minds. And thankfully, I've got the easy job. You know, Joseph gave as always, such a thorough assessment and analysis. So I really just have a few things to add before we get to the discussion. I'll just reiterate, and a lot of this will be kind of reiterating and emphasizing things that Joseph said, but to reiterate, this is a departure from US strategy since World War II. And we're kind of grappling with the new strategy that they have, that they're putting forward. And there are three things that I want to emphasize from this document as we grapple. One is what the document leaves out. Two is what they include. And three is who they're talking to and how. So in terms of what is left out, the most notable thing to me was anything about human rights is left out. This is noteworthy because the question of human rights as part of US strategy and US power on the world stage, that power is about some commitment to human rights, and that the US, in articulation of its strategy, has to at least gesture toward the notion of a global community, that the US is the leader of the free world, that is standing up for the free world against forces that would be against it, et cetera, et cetera. This has been part of US strategy since at least World War II. And that whole thing is kind of absent, really, from this document. And just to kind of make the point about how a sort of requisite of national security strategy documents has been some gesture toward human rights, and that somehow this national security strategy is in line with the American commitment toward human rights. You know, it'll come as no surprise that, you know, national security strategy documents under Obama and under Biden, at least rhetorically, gestured to human rights at the same time as those strategies violated human rights around the world with abandon. That's not a surprise that they rhetorically kind of nodded to human rights. But as I've been thinking about this and reflecting on this document, I thought it'd be interesting to actually go back to George W. Bush's national security strategy documents and read what he had to say about human rights, just for contrast to what Trump is saying and not saying now. So just real quick, you know, this is from Bush's national security strategy document in 2002. This is the first such document after 9/11. There was a whole section of the strategy document called Champion Aspirations for Human Dignity. This is George W. Bush. America must stand firmly for the non-negotiable demands of human dignity, the rule of law, limits on absolute power of the state, free speech, freedom of worship, equal justice, respect for women, religious and ethnic tolerance, and respect for private property, which is kind of remarkable and sobering to read. Obviously, it's rank with hypocrisy. You know, precisely at the time as they're writing this document about human dignity, they are exploring in legal and practical ways how to destroy human dignity by torturing people in Afghanistan and in Guantanamo Bay. This is in the kind of post 9/11 moment. Of course, they use the rhetoric of women's rights to justify a brutal invasion of Afghanistan and so on. So the point is not to take this at face value, but to see that they felt compelled as part of advancing their strategy, to say this is about upholding human rights. Trump doesn't even feel compelled to say that rhetorically. And that is part of the shift that Joseph is talking about. So that's when I say what's left out, that's what I mean. Number two, what is actually included? What is put in here? One thing is, there's this phrase that that comes up throughout the document: God-given natural rights of American citizens. They use that phrase repeatedly, and what they consider to be, so they don't talk about human rights. They don't talk about universal human rights. They talk about God-given natural rights, and the God-given right, according to them, that they enshrine the most is the right to what they consider sovereignty. And so their argument is that it is a natural right to commit to the sovereignty of this nation state, and that is their greatest commitment. And any threat to what they perceive to be American sovereignty is a threat to be combated by this strategy, that it is a threat to national security. This, there's a lot to say about this, but one thing is that this should be familiar, rhetoric. They're not just saying that they're defending sovereignty when it comes to national security kind of on the world stage. They talk about defending sovereignty all the time when they are justifying the horrific attack on migrants and on people of color that they're carrying out in this country right now. They're saying that this country has been invaded, that they're repelling an invasion, and so on. This is significant because, and Joseph spoke to this too, any notion of a division between domestic policy, what the federal government's policy is here, and then foreign policy, any notion that those are two separate things, this document just shatters. The domestic policy is the foreign policy. And so when they talk about defending American sovereignty, they're talking about that when they're talking about deploying ICE to terrorize our communities. And in the same way, what they're doing, carrying out these airstrikes in the Caribbean, what they're doing, the kind of horrendous violence that they're committing in the Middle East and elsewhere, this is all one and the same. The kind of culture wars, Joseph said that the document says that they're going to root out DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. The culture wars, against people of color, against any affirmative action, the kind of patriarchal, misogynistic notion that women belong in the kitchen and out of the public sphere, the complete erasure and violence against LGBTQ folks, particularly trans folks, especially in public, but really everywhere. All that stuff that is often understood as questions of domestic policy, right? What they are forcing in our public schools, what they're forcing on our campuses, what their police practices in our streets, and so on. For them, it's not just domestic. This is the culture wars also exist on the world stage. So this is really important because I think that we, unfortunately, and this is to be self-critical of us, we can have a tendency to see foreign policy over here and domestic policy over there. And they're saying, no. We've got the same agenda, and it is a global agenda, and it's a white supremacist agenda. Joseph spoke about this extensively, so I don't need to say too much more about it, except I do want to emphasize, the word civilization appears a lot in this document. They talk about it when they talk about the United States or sort of American society, but they especially talk about it when they talk about Europe. And just, here's a pull quote. We want to support our allies in preserving the freedom and security of Europe while restoring Europe's civilizational self-confidence and Western identity. The phrase Europe's civilizational self-confidence and Western identity appears repeatedly in this document. So just to emphasize what Joseph said, this is a thoroughly white supremacist, Western supremacist document. So that's what's included. The last point I want to talk about is the question of who they're talking to and how. And to say they open the document by saying, I'll read from at a bit of length here. To ensure, they open the document by explaining what this document is for. So they say, this is a quote, to ensure that America remains the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, and most successful country for decades to come, our country needs a coherent, focused strategy for how we interact with the world. And to get that right, all Americans need to know what exactly it is we are trying to do and why. Well, this is really interesting because, before embarking on this white supremacist document that, argues explicitly and implicitly that the US has absolutely no responsibility and certainly no accountability to the world, certainly no accountability to things like international law or any notion of human rights. Before launching into all that, before launching into what they want for US power to look like in the various regions of the world, before they get into all of that, they start by saying, you reader, this is what a strategy is. And this is why we're writing this, because for this to succeed, you actually have to be on board. Now, I think this is obviously totally cynical. It is no less an elite project than the projects of the administrations that they critique. It is absolutely, as Joseph said, about safeguarding the wealth and power of the US elite at the expense, certainly, of people all around the world, and I would argue of the majority of people in this country as well. But the style, the approach is anti-elite. The approach is we want to have a public conversation about this. And this is extremely important because it stands in contrast, frankly, to the Democratic Party approach. And just to give one example, people may have seen there's a clip floating around social media of Hillary Clinton talking about the outpouring of outrage in this country against the genocide in Gaza. And she says basically that young people have been fooled by social media. We're too stupid to get it, And this really has been the ethos. This was the response of the Biden administration when we went out in the streets to demand an end to the genocide then. The response was basically like, you don't get it. You're too stupid. Not only does Israel have a right to defend itself, they went into all of that, but it's also that, this is for the adult table to figure out foreign policy, and you don't belong here. And stylistically, MAGA is saying something different, and that is extremely dangerous. And I think it points to our responsibility in the peace movement, in the anti-war movement, to have a public conversation about US foreign policy so that MAGA is not the only force that is trying to talk to the US public about what the US is doing on the world stage, right? Is not the only force saying that people in this country should have a say, and they don't mean it when they say, but we do mean it. We should have a say, and we need to raise our voices about and against what this country is actually doing. So I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to the questions and discussion.
Thank you, Khury, for those insightful remarks and pointing us towards our political responsibilities in tackling this. I want to open it up for questions. I'll just make one. I'm going to make one more remark. Amplifying Khury's remarks that there's very little about human rights in this statement, in this document, or any at all. A whole host of concepts that we're accustomed to think as foundational to U.S. foreign policy, at least to the rhetoric, are completely absent. International institutions, no mention, except to be pejorative. International law, not mentioned. United Nations, not mentioned. The welfare of anyone besides Americans, not mentioned. Multilateralism, not mentioned. There is mention that the U.S. has allies, and they seem to think that's a good thing. But that's it. So it's stark that this so-called sovereigntist ideology, which each country just fends for itself, we're back to the foundations of the Westphalian system, where we don't care about any other country. We're out for our own interests. That's put forward explicitly as a theory. Anyway, I don't want to ramble. Let me ask people to raise their virtual hand if they have a question. Jeffrey is first. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
First off, this is about this meeting's about American imperialism, correct?
It's about the Trump national security strategy. Go ahead, Jeffrey. What's your question?
And that is that how do we fix it so it's how do we fix it in the future so no person can follow that kind of strategy, especially if it's bad. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Is it a good one?
So I'll jump in and just say, look, I mean, we've got to educate, we've got to organize, we've got to change. We've got to change those who are ruling us. We've got to change the distribution of power in this country. You know, we've done this in the past when we've been able to mobilize popular mobilization. You know, any number of issues, it's central to our history. But we've got to do it. One other thing, just one other thing to say, in terms of human rights, it's actually quite explicit that we won't recognize human rights, both in relationship to U.S. relations with China and with the Gulf and Arab states. Very clear. It's all about the money.
I mean, I can't help but mention that, like during the Gaza war, so many people pointed out that the West had abandoned any pretense of observing international law and human rights, and that the international law regime was over. And guess what? This came true a lot sooner than some of us believed it would be possible. Mary Ellen is next with a question.
Oh. Yeah, oops, thanks a lot. Let me turn my video on. Fascinating conversation, and thanks for both of your insightful comments.
Right.
On the one hand, I'll sort of state something, and then maybe either of you can respond. On the one hand, it almost seems schizophrenic to me, because on the one hand, they're saying, you know, we want the biggest, most powerful military, et cetera, and yet they're relinquishing, at least rhetorically, relinquishing their power, their global hegemony. So what that in addition to this new Monroe Doctrine, or someone called it the Donroe Doctrine, it also indicates to me that there's another enemy that the administration or people who are in power now are aiming for, and that is the populace here in the States. And to me, that, I mean, certainly very chilling. We've already seen it put in practice, certainly. So I guess I'm just trying to say that given the way that, you know, they're cracking down on dissent, getting some pushback, you know, within the courts, but you know, we'll see how far that can go. And also this whole thing about, you know, the billionaires grabbing up all of our legacy media. That's really frightening. And I guess I just want to say that this says to me that we really need to think very carefully about how to protect ourselves. And it's going to be a really big challenge. Thanks.
Yeah. Do
you want to jump in? Tackle? No.
Why don't you go first, Khury? I want to come in for a little bit.
Yeah, that's such a, you know, Mary Ellen, I think that you're actually getting at kind of the central, one of the central things that we have to be grappling with understanding what exactly this shift is, because they actually want to continue American dominance, but not with the same strategy that the U.S. has dominated since World War II, right? And so that strategy has involved. I mean, I remember when Biden was elected after, you know, Trump's first term, he had this catchphrase that I think actually really summarized the whole U.S. approach to power post World War II, where he said, so it's like Trump is over, and then Biden comes back and he says, America's back at the head of the table. That was the model that after World War II, the U.S. emerges as the most powerful country in the world, and it calls the shots. It gathers its allies and says, here's what the world economy is going to look like. The dollar is going to be number one. We're going to build these institutions, the World Bank, IMF, et cetera, et cetera. Here's what the dominant military alliances are going to be. It's going to be NATO, et cetera, et cetera. Here's what the international law and kind of international human rights framework that we're going to reference as we're doing whatever we want is going to look like. It's going to be UN, we're going to have the headquarters in New York, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's about kind of constructing a whole way of that international politics and economics and military action would happen with the US kind of underwriting it and upholding it, being at the head of the table. And Trump is saying that strategy no longer works, basically. And what I have found very useful is actually to go back to what US imperialism looked like before World War II. So earlier this year, as this was kind of starting, I was like, what is going on? And I found myself reading a lot about the 1920s, about the early 1900s, about 1898 and the Spanish-American War, right? Like, I think there's been this kind of notion, that very binary notion that Trump is like against intervention and he's against the forever wars and therefore would somehow be anti-militarism. And I think that a lot of people and a lot of commentators were very confused when we see all kinds of militarism under Trump. And if you go back to that period in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the U.S. is doing all kinds of interventions. It is invading Haiti and occupying the Dominican Republic. It is sending troops to Lebanon. I mean, this is kind of the time actually when the U.S. empire is being crafted. But this is before the UN. It's before, really international law as we understand it, before a global, an international community as we understand it. And I think that these are the points of reference actually informing what Trump is doing. They're not creative enough to like invent a new way of doing things. They're going back. They want to go back to go forward, and there's I'll just end on this point. This kind of interesting conversation. They talk about this. I don't think it makes it in this document, but you'll see it in kind of MAGA circles. The notion of primacy versus hegemony. So they don't only want hegemony, which is, and I think about Bill Clinton in the 90s, the phrase from one of his national security strategy documents was full spectrum dominance. We want the US to dominate everywhere. That's hegemony. Trump is like, we don't need to dominate everywhere. We don't need to run NATO. I don't care about every single thing that happens in Europe, but we do want to be number one. We want to do whatever we want. So we want primacy, but not necessarily hegemony. It's a different strategy for dominance.
So I'll just come in with a couple of comments. Khury is right on as usual. I began my talk by talking about the structural changes in the world and in the United States. And I think we need to understand this strategy as a way of compensating for the changes. There was the analysis after the Second World War. The United States had 50% of the world's GDP. It doesn't anymore. And China has a stronger economy in many ways than we do, and it's growing. I mean, it graduates 4 times as many engineers per year as the United States. I mean, just think about what that means. So I think what we're seeing here is kind of a consolidation of U.S. power. And while, as it says, it doesn't want to control every development around the world, with the commitment to having the strongest and most lethal military in the world, it ultimately does want to be able to dominate any competitor. And I think I think what we see, and we don't really have good depth analysis in the peace movement, is around the race around AI and cyber. I mean, while nuclear weapons are not the only ones that can basically end all life. You have the penetration. I mean, on all sides, the U.S. has penetrated Chinese and Russian systems, water, and all the rest, and they've done the same to the United States. So you can come to an absolutely catastrophic war without nuclear weapons or with nuclear weapons. And while I'm on the subject of nuclear weapons, I want to just say one more thing about Trump's threat to resume nuclear weapons testing, which again is too little remarked here. But the reality is that it threatens nuclear weapons proliferation. I've in the tradition of Sesame Street, which one of these is not like the others, I found myself in this track 2 session with names I can't. It's confidential. I can't say who it is, but it's ridiculous that I'm in it. But what they're saying is that if the U.S. holds to this, when we come into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Review Conference in late April and May, it's going to mean that that conference will fail, that you can't come to any agreements. That would be the 3rd review conference in a row that will have failed. And the expectation is if it goes down, you won't have an immediate end to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but what you'll see is some countries splitting off from it. In South Korea, the majority of people want their country to have a nuclear arsenal. Trump did not obliterate Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The Saudis want a nuclear weapon. So you could see over time the unraveling of the NPT, and while the United States or Russia, or where we have focused our anxieties about nuclear weapons, the reality is that a relatively small nuclear war, comparatively, if there's such a thing, between say India and Pakistan, the scientific societies tell us that the global cooling that will come will kill 2 billion people. So one more thing I wanted to say in terms of, I really appreciated Khury naming that it's the domestic policy is the foreign policy. And actually, that's always been the case. It's just a different domestic policy. But I think, Mary Ellen, to understand that what we're dealing with is an effort to establish a fascist state, a fascist culture, a fascist rule, white supremacist being one of its dimensions. And so the struggle that we're in is fundamental. I think one way to understand it, Walden Bellow wrote a book called Counter-Revolution. And I think one way to understand what's going on is that it's a counter-revolution against all of the gains in civil rights, in terms of economic rights, in terms of women's rights, across the boards. And these people are nasty and ruthless. And so we have to develop our strategies and our vision. So, we're in a way fortunate to be living in Massachusetts as opposed to, say, Montana or Arizona. We do have a bit more room here, but we could see the Mississippi National Guard coming into Boston. So we have to, I think, understand quite how serious and quite how dangerous these people are. I mean, there's this quote from Steve Bannon, who was saying that they have to take total control of all government agencies before the 2026 election, because if they lose the election, all of them could go to jail. And so we're also dealing with a frightened elite at the moment. I've been saying that when it comes to defending the election 2026, 2028, ultimately, I think the only tool that we have will be a general strike. I mean, we can do all kinds of oversight and the rest, but people have to say that holding on to some form of constitutional democracy is so important that we'll stop everything and we'll force the elite to recognize that we have to have democracy.
Thanks. Our speakers have kindly agreed to run till 7:15, but we're going to try to get 2 or 3 more questions in that time. So let's pick up the pace. Grace Southon, I think, is calling in from New Zealand, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. standing rather on the sidelines, wondering how it's going to affect us. I note that they want other nations to see them as their partner of first choice, and we will, through various means, discourage their collaboration with others. What would we take from that?
Well, a range of them. I mean, for one thing, economics. I mean, Australia has got to be the U.S. market, and as they look at China and recognizing that the U.S. economy is not strong enough to go it alone against China, what the doctrine says is we need to create a group that collaborates economically. Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Europeans, to contain China. And of course, you're going to be paying a lot of money if they prevail to build a new nuclear submarine. And Australia is seen as a major principal ally, militarily as well as economically, against China. And I guess the last thing to say is, their view of white supremacist culture and political structure is not only in the U.S., it's global. And you can see them as they're trying to exercise it in Europe. Australia has its own racial tensions, right? And racial history. So I think you can expect that they'll do their best to bring Australia further into a white supremacist culture.
I hope you're not confusing Australia with New Zealand.
I'm sorry, New Zealand. The same applies. Australia. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Take me out to that.
I don't think New Zealand is part of the
shed.
They're not part of the subdeal yet, as far as I know.
But New Zealand, you do now have a conservative government. You do have, as I understand it, a somewhat white supremacist government. But merci Dieu for your nuclear allergy, and I hope you hold it.
Khury, a comment from you, or you want to?
Yeah, I'll be super quick and just say, I mean, the U.S. is under Trump is trying to renegotiate international relations with each state, and the country like New Zealand, that includes drawing on New Zealand has pushed back against U.S. policy at different points in history. There's also kind of cooperated. There's the Five Eyes Alliance, this kind of global surveillance apparatus that New Zealand's part of, and so they're kind of banking on other countries either joining reluctantly or enthusiastically, and it's some are joining enthusiastically, and so I think that what you all do there is important. Actually, if the people of New Zealand say no, we're not going to go along with this, and then the government is compelled to say we are also not going to go along with this, that actually would really matter. Solidarity to our friends down in the Southern Hemisphere.
Thanks. Okay, let's go to Moji Aga.
Do you have my voice?
Yes, we hear you. Thank you.
Great. Hello and thank you. I'll make this quick. I am in so much agreement with everything that Brother Khury and Brother Joseph are saying, and Brother Joseph was a guest of the peace-seeking Iranian veterans, of which I'm the founder, and I get disappointed every time I hear him use the term the Gulf as opposed to the Persian Gulf. The Gulf or the Arabian Gulf goes back all the way to the Sykes-Picot, that colonial conspiracy, which then got strengthened when Dr. Mossadegh of Iran was overthrown by the CIA with the collaboration of Israel, the newly created Israel. And there was a Zionist spy called Elijah Cohen who planted the idea of calling the Persian Gulf, which has been called the Persian Gulf for 3,000 years, into the mind of Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. The purpose was to divide and conquer. Persians from Arabs, and Shias from Sunnis. So please do not use the term the Gulf. It's a colonial term. Please.
Moji, just to say that I have your voice in my head, not infrequently. The challenge for me is that I just don't engage with nationalism of any sort. And so I would be happier if we had some kind of word for that water. So it's not Persian, it's not Arab, it's not American, but I certainly understand where you're coming from.
Hey, Moji, you want to respond? And if anyone else would raise their hand, you can have one more question. Okay, if not, we can wrap it there. I want to thank
I see
everyone for
Jeffrey's
being
hand
here.
up, Cole, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yes, Khury?
I see Jeffrey's hand up.
Yeah, he already had a turn though, so I was going to skip him. But
Oh.
if maybe I'll ask you and Joseph each to make a final comment, if you would. Would you go ahead and do that, Khury?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, this was. I'm grateful for this discussion. There's a lot more to discuss, and one thing that I'll just say, and this is sobering. You know, Joseph spoke to an editorial in the New York Times on Sunday. This is part of a series of editorials that the New York Times editorial board is doing. That is them sounding the alarm from their perspective of how they're arguing that the U.S. military establishment is basically unprepared for the wars of the future, and so it's actually time for. They're also arguing for a reorientation. The notion that the U.S. should change its strategy or revisit its strategy or question its strategy, it doesn't actually start with this Trump administration. I think this has been a question for a long time. The notion that China presents the greatest threat to U.S. power did not start with Trump. This has been going on for a long time. And a number of people, including people like Hillary Clinton, who also has said, the way that we procure weapons, the weapon systems that we invest in are the wrong ones. The New York Times, others have said we have to actually shift. And Trump is saying, okay, here's a shift. So I only bring that up not to kind of, whatever, to extend the critique, but to say that we should understand that there is an appetite in the U.S. elite broadly for the revisiting of U.S. strategy and for some shifts. And I think that's important for understanding why there's been a bit of not a bit, there's an extent to which Trump is being tolerated actually by corporations and by others in the political class. And when he is being critiqued, it's on these very narrow bases. I mean, I'm grateful, it's a good thing that there has been some conversation in Congress about and calling for some more information and accountability on this airstrike that happened in the Caribbean. But it is on the most narrow basis. It's saying, this one ship, the second strike seems to have been illegal as opposed to the first strike, which was also illegal, to the previous, 24 strikes, which were also illegal, and so on. I think that the contestation has been so narrow because there's actually quite a bit of agreement, or a bit of a shared recognition, even if they disagree on the strategy, the strategic way forward and the outlook. They are saying, well, yep, China is rising, and we are all worried about that. And yeah, maybe Trump is onto some things. So that's just all to say, our work in the anti-war world and the peace movement, our work is we really have our work cut out for us. And conversely, because Trump is saying we need a shift, we need to do things differently, we should take that opening and say we do need a shift. We do need to do things differently. But we need to argue that on our basis, on the basis that centers people's humanity, that centers anti-racism, that joins with the people all around the world who are actually fighting against authoritarianism, because this is not just a US thing. We want to offer an internationalist perspective. That's really critical and really urgent. So I will end there. Thank you all so much.
Amen. Thank you, Khury. Joseph, your final remarks.
Khury, you're wonderful. And part of me is thinking, God, it'd be nice to co-author an article with you. But just to say that, I think we're at the beginning of this major transformation. And transformations, you say, came before. I mean, remember the pivot to Asia came with Obama, right? Which was a recognition of what you were pointing to. And I think at one level, what's going to be, I mean, we have to chew gum and walk at the same time, right? We have to find ways to be working to prevent the worst catastrophe in relationship to Venezuela, which obviously relates in turn to Cuba. The Trump plan for Gaza is not a peace plan. The genocide goes on. And we have to find ways to continue to oppose that and do what we can to stop the killing, right? And do what we can to bring some degree of peace. But I think we also, narrative is central. I mean, I think we've been learning that. What is the story? And people move on the basis of their worldview, on the basis of the narrative that has framed them. So I think finding ways to educate about both the agenda of this strategy, but also its impacts on human beings is really important to us. And so I think we've got to do that work as well. One of the other things you're going to see here is that with the increased military spending, there go more social services. There goes more housing, and we're seeing it in Europe. The analysis there is that this opens the way for extreme right-wing groups. Trump is losing popularity, but it's not just Trump. It's a whole structure behind him, and we're going to have to challenge that. So I don't know that I'm particularly articulate at this point, but just to appreciate your and Cole's work, and just to appeal to, we were about 100 people on this, as I noticed. We all have to do all that we can, because if we don't, no one will.
Thanks to you both. And I do want to just pick up a point that Khury made in his opening remarks, that this strategy of Trump is written in an accessible style. He is trying to build a political movement around this program. I think that's crucially important, and it is crucially important we in the peace movement have to work with our brothers and sisters across the progressive movement and bring a peace perspective that's integrated with the domestic perspective. And we have not done that adequately. That's our challenge. We have to be accessible, and we have to take up the challenge. I couldn't agree more with the points that are made by each of you. Thank you very much. Moji, I apologize that we didn't get back to you to respond to Joseph about the Persian Gulf, or whatever Gulf we're going to call it. And and I see in the chat that Khury and Joseph are thinking of turning this into a commonly authored article. I think that would be a great initiative if the two of you find time in your busy schedules to do it. And we look forward to hearing more from each of you. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Good night.